Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this program. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Welcome, everyone, to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility on this Martin Luther King Day, January 20th, 2014. It is a pleasure to be with you. We missed a couple of programs last week for what I think are substantial, for a substantial reason. One was due to me, and one was not due to me, but they were both legitimate, and I apologize for that. It is a pleasure to be with you today, and I miss being here. It's been a full week since we've been together last Monday, so I wanted to pick up a little bit on some of the things we were doing the last time we were together, which was a week ago, and maybe pick up a little bit from there and go on. A few pieces of housework, or housekeeping as it were. I wanted to first make sure that everybody has the phone number. It is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. If you'd like to contact me directly and have a reaction, you want to make it just directly to me, by all means, I would love to hear from you. My email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. A couple of words about programming this week, because today, for example, we're beginning an hour earlier. That's due to my schedule. I have a board meeting that begins at 5:30 this evening, so when we go off the air at 5 here in the East, I'm going to have to skedaddle and get myself out to a board meeting that begins at 5:30. It's a once a month thing, and of course we didn't meet during the holiday season, so tonight will be the first time we've met since November. So, and if you remember, it was about that time that we had a 3 o'clock, 1 hour early start then as well, for the same reason. I do chair the local hospital board here, and we have our board meeting on the third Monday of each month. And so I have to begin these programs earlier on that day. Tomorrow, then, we'll be back to our same start time, which will be in the East, 4 to 6 p.m. And I have to tell you that we're not going to be doing a program on Wednesday. And this one is not due to with me. This is due to Bob Kincaid, who produces the program, and will be on the road on Wednesday, and not able to be on the other line and be there to receive your calls and make sure that when you call we can get you on the air, and all the other good stuff that Bob does at the other end that I don't see. I just kind of push a few buttons and then start to talk, and then somebody tells me it's time to stop talking, and I stop. But anyway, so again, we're beginning an hour early today, but we'll be back at our regular time tomorrow, and we will not be doing a program on Wednesday. Head On Radio Network will, I presume, broadcast an earlier, one of our earlier programs. And if you think about it now, we've been on the air for something in the area of 7 to 8 months. And so we have quite a few programs that we've done in the past, and a number of them are standalone programs, which means they aren't continuation from the day before or anything like that. And so they set perfectly into some of these suddenly open slots. And that's very good, because very honestly, some of this stuff becomes so overwhelming that after a while there's no way in the world that anybody can keep track of all of this stuff and remember all of this stuff either. I find, in fact, I think you remember not too long ago we went back to the auto letter of 1786 to Comte de Vergennes about the political nature of what was happening in New York the year in fall of '86 prior to the convening of the Constitutional Convention. It just seemed to me that it was time to revisit that letter, because the letter is so loaded, so rich in what it suggests, that after a while you keep kind of pointing to examples of that same kind of thing, and then after a while you almost say to yourself, it's really time that we revisit that letter. So again, we do have some programs we can draw on, standalone programs, and I trust that Bob and the other folks at Head On Radio Network will be able to make appropriate use of our time slot on Wednesday. Before we get into a program specific to the virtual center, I wanted to make a comment about Bob Kincaid and about his rather busy weekend and time last week. As many of you, I'm sure, know, Bob was asked to appear a couple of weeks ago on the MSNBC program at 8 in the evening, 8 to 9 weekday evenings with Chris Hayes. And then last week he was asked to appear yet once again, all of it related to the chemical spill in the 9 counties of West Virginia, which has rendered undrinkable for so long water to approximately 300,000 West Virginia citizens in 9 counties. Most of the attention has been focused around Charleston, the state capital, but on the other hand, that's understandable, not only because that's where most of the people are, but also that's where the spill happened. And so, the attention has been there. But as you know, there have been a series of events since the original spill, which was reported on the 9th of January, a Thursday. Now there are some suggestions that maybe it was going on prior to that. There have been indications that there were inspections, and they were kind of look the other way kind of inspections, apparently. This is not, but Bob is very, very knowledgeable about this area, and I know he's been focusing quite a bit on his program. What I wanted to comment on is, first of all, I wanted to basically congratulate Bob. And what I mean is, I've watched him on the Chris Hayes program twice, and I watched him on Melissa Harris Perry's program Sunday morning yesterday from 11 to 11:30 in the morning. And I thought Bob's presentation in all of those situations was excellent. His comments were measured. They were. He was balanced. And what I mean is he was fair. He was quoting data as the data exists. And more important, I think, out of this whole thing, what I've begun to see more and more, and especially this weekend kind of confirmed it, is the absolutely vital role that this network plays in terms of our conversation about contemporary issues, both political, human, and social. And I mean that. The fact that a story which is getting national attention on a national network is going to the well, so to speak, and contacting Bob Kincaid for his on-site views about the situation in West Virginia is, for me personally, because I know Bob, is exhilarating. But the other thing is, I think it's very important, because I think we all have to confront the fact that there tends to be a national image of West Virginia which suggests that there's nobody as articulate as Bob Kincaid in West Virginia. And I think what Bob did in his three performances that I've seen in the last 10 days or so indicate very clearly that indeed there is. And I think he's opened a lot of eyes. I think he's also made people a lot more aware of the significance of some of the things that are happening, not only to the people of West Virginia, but within West Virginia itself. Most of the national image of what's going on in West Virginia is being painted, for the most part, by the very organizations that are under scrutiny because of this spill. The chemical companies, state government, the governor, spokesman for the state legislature, spokesman for the water company, and coal companies. And it's very obvious now that while there has been a concerted effort to try to make sure, to try to soften the blow, so to speak, as attention is being focused more and more on these folks, and as Bob did very well to link it to previous environmental situations, obviously going back to the Exxon Valdez, but the BP spill in the Gulf, and on and on and on. These things continue to go on, and part of the reason is because when the cameras turn off, and when no longer these organizations are forced to operate in the light of day, then there tends to be a tendency to kind of soften the results, and things tend to go on business as usual. And I think what Bob is doing is making that much more difficult this time. And I commend him for it. I commend MSNBC for the story. Because what we're talking about here is the kind of investigative journalism that doesn't happen anymore, rarely. We just don't see it anymore. More and more, our media seems to become the mouthpiece of the people that take out the most advertising, that buy the most advertising. And I think what we're seeing here over the last couple of weeks is an example of investigative journalism of the best kind. And it's happening in a lot of places, the Charleston Gazette and the local paper here. And very honestly, some of the media outlets that are broadcasting and printing this information are not naturally inclined to do this. But the fact of the matter is, this is getting so much attention, and it's so important, and there's so much data, and there are so many people involved and potentially being hurt by this, that it seems to me they've, whether reluctantly or excitedly, they've taken this on and they're broadcasting information. For example, personally, I've made references to this before, but again, this particular program is not specifically about this, but I think it all fits into the frame of considerations about the U.S. Constitution and about the rights of citizens and organizations and corporations and the whole issue of public responsibility and the public interest and all the rest of it. It seems to me all of it indeed does fit. But for example, and I'm not going to get into the details here because I'd be into an area that I'm really not competent to elaborate on. But to see a situation evolve like this, to see a crisis emerge, and the company that does it to declare bankruptcy only a few days after the event itself happened, and then to find out that the organization which created bankruptcy was in fact reorganized and only incorporated in December, less than a month ago. And then to see another organization with a person's name the same agree to pick up the pieces of the first organization, what we're beginning to see is some high-power corporate shenanigans and behavior here, which to say is very suspicious is kind of an understatement. But the point is, if somebody isn't there constantly digging and putting this stuff out there, the story will die. And then those who have a vested interest in spinning or selling a particular point of view about the issue will be able to take over, as is usually happens. These kinds of things have been happening. Companies have been coming into existence and going out of business in West Virginia for a long time. And basically what it suggests to me, and this is what caused me, one thing that caused me to address this at all today. One of the things that it caused me to realize is that nowhere else in in West Virginia would organizations feel like they could even have a chance of getting away with things like this. And I think that's something that all of us needed to know. It needed to be out there. The rest of the people the rest of the nation needed to know. And thanks in large part to the Head On Radio Network and to Bob Kincaid, they do know. And all I can say is more power to him and more power to this network. And if there's ever any question as to the value of keeping a network like this on the air, I think we've seen it. And I have told people, have asked me over and over again, what is the Head On Radio Network? Who is Bob? I've called everybody trying to get them to tune in on this. Not so much because I want them to witness and hear Bob Kincaid. That's part of it. But also because I want them to know what's happening here in West Virginia. And I think it's an organization like the Head On Radio Network that lets people know, and boy, do we need it. I think we're beginning to, the issue that we started to delve into more than a week ago was the issue of privacy. And, of course, with the NSA situation and Edward Snowden and the President's speech on Friday about changes in NSA policy, which we hopefully will get into in a moment, I think the issue of individual privacy and basically the whole idea of individual freedom, which is linked directly to it, is on the table here. And I think everybody needs to know it, and everybody needs to be aware of some of the things that are working against the best interests of citizens and their privacy and their freedom. And so, again, I just had to take a couple of minutes at the beginning of our program today and let people listening know very honestly, and I mean this sincerely, how very, very proud I am to even be here, to be affiliated with the Head On Radio Network, even in the minor way that I am. This weekend was something that made me feel pretty darn good. And you have to realize this was a weekend in which the New England Patriots lost. So, and I still feel good. So I guess what I'm saying is that this kind of kind of reinvigorates me, I guess is what I'm saying. The fact that the reactions from the outside are so positive, and people now are so interested in raising some serious questions. And of course, it's being, it's constantly being linked and tied up, and it's running simultaneously with what's going on in New Jersey with the bridge closure situation with Governor Christie, and of course that's another national situation that's getting a lot of attention. But I think the one thing we need to know, and the founders knew this, that if government is going to do what government is supposed to do, then there needs to be citizen scrutiny in order to make sure they do it. When public agencies and institutions are allowed to operate in the dark, when citizens assume that everything is right and don't care anymore, things start to go bad, haywire. This isn't just me talking. This is what the founders knew. I mean, the quote, Madison quote, about the whole idea of a freedom of the press and the extent to which people needed information in order to, at least theoretically, hold government accountable, has real meaning. And I think we've seen it in the last several days in action. So again, in fact, I asked myself this morning, in the midst of taking a shower, I was asking myself, if I was in Charleston, would I be taking this shower? Because I don't know. They're saying that the water's all right, but then on the other hand, they say, on the other hand, if you're pregnant, don't drink it and don't shower with it. And I'm thinking, well, maybe for purposes of my own safety, maybe I'd come down on the side that for purposes of this particular crisis, let's all assume that we're all pregnant. And let's wait until the all clear is signaled for those who are pregnant, and then we'll know. But anyway, congratulations, Bob, and more power to you. You did a wonderful job, and I appreciate it. And I know that the people listening to you and are listening here to us here at the Virtual Center agree. So I want to thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bill.
Okay, Bob, you're very welcome. I had a little. This is very short, but on the other hand, I thought it was quite telling and quite important. I received an email from a listener, and it's short, and it has some wonderful quotes in it, and it refers to a position taken by a very prominent conservative minister, Brian Fisher, who is head of the American Family Association. And in a recent program, Brian Fisher was referring back to the 18th century requirements of property ownership for voting. And his point in his presentation was that this was a pretty sensible policy for any democracy. The implication being that maybe it would serve us well if we went back to that and only reserved the right to vote to those who own property. And there's quite an extensive quote here for people that can't watch the clips of Brian Fisher's speech online, and you can. But this is verbatim what he said. And the reason I wanted to share it with you is not only because of the issue itself, but because of Brian Fisher's explanation of the 18th century policy on property ownership. To be very honest with you, it's pretty darn good. I think that Fisher has probably explained the rationale behind this program as well as anybody I've read or seen. Many authors and historians who focus on this period have focused on the property qualifications issue. For years, many people believed that that was the way that the few maintained control in colonial America. That basically only the rich could vote because you had to own property in order to vote. And research since then has revealed in the late colonial period, in the early period after the Revolution, in other words, the 1780s, that the data shows that actually more people could meet many of these property qualifications than we ever dreamed of earlier. And so the fact of the matter is, the fact that people could vote was not really the issue. The fact was that they didn't. And so the most telling question for historians of late, and I don't mean recently in the last few years, I mean in the last 25 years or so, the focus of attention has not been on the fact as to whether property qualifications kept people from voting. The real concentration has been on why, even though so many people could, because of the availability of land, could rather easily meet the property qualifications for voting, the reality was why, in fact, didn't more of them exercise that right? Why were so many people willing to concede power and concede the right to make decisions to those they considered to be their betters, the few? And that's the reality. And so in a sense, the fact that so few people voted is not the issue. The fact that so many more could vote but didn't is the issue. But before we address that, let's go. I wanted to share with you Brian Fisher's explanation of the 18th century idea of only property owners being allowed to vote. I think it's pretty good, but I leave it to you to make that determination. Fisher says the following: You know, back in the day, the colonial period, you had to be a landowner, a property owner, to be eligible to vote. And I don't think that's a bad idea. And the reason is very simple. If somebody owns property in a community, they're vested in the community. If they're renters, they're going to be up and gone. They could leave the next day. They have no tie to the community. They've got no long-term investment in the community. But somebody who owns property, he cares now. He cares about the public policies that manage that community because it's going to affect his property. It's going to affect the use of his property. It's going to affect the value of his property. It's going to affect what he's able to do with his property. It's going to affect his family who lives on that property. He's vested. So he's going to have a real interest in seeing what kind of policies are adopted. But see, people that are not property owners, it's like people that pay no taxes. They've got no skin in the game. They don't care about the same things that somebody does who's rooted in the community. Unquote. All of that is verbatim the position taken by Brian Fisher. And one of our listeners sent it to me, and I sent back and told him that I would use this because I thought it was pretty powerful.
Hey, Dr. Bill.
Yes, Bob.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I seldom do so. But that load of errant balderdash has me tearing at my hair.
It does.
I have not lately heard such a conglomeration of Eurocentric, privileged, verbiage. I don't know how long. I mean,
pretty good, isn't it?
Well, I mean, what? So let's when the white folks landed here in North America, there were on this continent something approaching 20 million human beings who had no European conceptualization of the ability to own property.
Right.
Is this fundamentalist, whatever he is, asserting that, well, I guess he is. He's asserting that they had no right to be living where they were living.
He's assuming that with the arrival of whites became the arrival of civilization, and what we were talking about prior to that was a pre-civilized situation. And he's assuming that property, that community only exists with Anglo-Saxon white settlement. You're right. And the fact that he's suggesting that it's not a bad idea, and suggesting that maybe we ought to think about it here, is frightening, and that's the reason I wanted to share it. However, the only positive part of this, Bob, is that from things that I've read, he's pretty well nailed down the rationale for property qualifications. In other words, this is what many of the state leaders who were instrumental in enacting legislation which established these property rights. This is basically the position that they argued. This was their rationale for doing it. And the thing that I like about this is that he so clearly articulates what these people believe. That, again, it doesn't mean that it doesn't in any way mean that it's a worthy policy at all. But it's explained. He explains it very well. He's
yes.
right. He's
but
right.
it also proceeds from a false premise, does it not?
Does? Go ahead.
And by that I mean that he is suggesting that there is only one way to view community, that there is only one way to view culture.
That's right.
And that the only way to view it is the white way to view it, and the white way is the right way.
There's only one culture. That all of those assumptions are correct, Bob. All of those assumptions are correct. The one piece that he leaves out, and I think it even adds to this, is that, you know, if he had added another couple of sentences, he might have said, because it follows along very naturally. not only did people have to own property to be eligible to vote, but those people who wanted to be elected to public office had to own more property.
Yes.
And the implication was that the ownership of property signified not only commitment to community, but also ability, intelligence, business acumen, whatever you wanted to call it. In other words, clearly the implication of all of this legislation is that the people with the most are the people who have the most right to make decisions for everybody else because they're obviously the most competent. And the amount of property they own proves it.
Including, in that instance, some human beings here and there as property.
Yeah. Slave property, exactly. Obviously, they didn't count. And neither did Native Americans count. But essentially what we're suggesting is, and in fact, the way they read, and this is true of the founders as well, the way they read John Locke's treatment of the state of nature and the whole idea of property ownership in the state of nature and the whole idea of private property, the origin of private property as explained by Locke in the state of nature, was that if you expend your labor, if you literally invest your sweat in a piece of property, whether it's to farm it or to timber it or whatever it is, then effectively you have laid claim, legitimate claim to that piece of property. But the point, Locke's point, and this is what's often skipped, is that Locke made the point that it's very, very important to realize that the only entitlement that people have to property in which they invest their labor is property that they can readily use. That one of the things that Locke warned against was the idea of people claiming private ownership of more property than they could possibly use, because in doing that, they were denying the right of everybody else to own property.
Dr. Bill, may we assume that Locke, when he was writing that, had at hand in his era the history of the late Roman Republic?
Oh, I would assume that, yes.
Because that was one of the it's not often talked about. Mostly we talk about Sulla and the proscriptions and the general chaotic political collapse of the Republic into vicious little cults of personality. But underpinning all of that was the fact that everything that had allowed the Roman Republic to rise, in other words, small tenant holders who would leave, a la Cincinnatus, leave their plows and take up the sword. That's how the Republic got to be what it was.
Exactly.
And it is afterward when massive wealth begins to basically engage in an enclosure and push the smallholders off their land that the Republic collapses and empire comes.
That's right. That's right, Bob.
So, I mean, it seems to me that he wasn't just theorizing in that regard.
No.
There was a concrete example to which he could turn.
And what he was basically referring to, as you point out so well, is that in order to maintain stability within the community, there needs to be access for everybody. And there was also the idea of the commons that is incorporated into Locke's thinking as well, that there needs to be property devoted to the best interests of everybody that is not up for private ownership, but rather belongs to the entire public, the entire community. And there's absolutely no question that this is what would sustain your community, is the access of opportunity. There's no reason for people to support, and Locke makes this point, there's no reason for people to support the idea of individual freedom when everything that freedom would allow you to do is not available to you. And so basically what you have then is the potential for real turmoil and internal strife. And so
even collapse.
Yeah, in collapse. So maintaining access, and Locke's idea was that there's enough property for everybody, but there needs to be limits on what people have a right to. And that's the part of Locke that conservatives never quote, never cite. They basically talk about the idea of protection of private property and the creation of government by the property in order to protect property. And the implication in Locke is the only people that have rights at all are people with property. And that's where this guy's coming from. Is that very narrow, skewed view. And I think, though, that the idea that the people with the most property are, in effect, able to stand as the most intelligent people and the people who are due power and audience, I think that's very significant because it clearly underwrites much of this legislation.
Well, it seems like the right wing's approach to Locke is like someone who goes to bake a batch of cookies, and they're going to be chocolate chip cookies, and they leave the chocolate chips out, and the flour, and the sugar, and the butter, and all they have is salt, and they pull salt out of the oven and say, look, it's chocolate chip cookies.
Bob, it's cherry picking. It's cherry picking history to support an agenda, a contemporary agenda. I mean, it's just yet one more example of things where, you know, that in essence there's enough truth in there to make it sound credible, but in fact you really need to examine and see what's left out, what they don't include. And, you know, John Locke wrote his essays on civil government, and they're cited often by, obviously, by conservative people that focus on the idea of individual liberty. And that's where Locke, I mean, that's where Madison comes from, no question, at the Constitutional Convention. But he also wrote a discourse on civil, I can't remember the name of it right now, but his whole point was to focus on the nature of the community and all the people in it, not just the few who have power. And it's almost like Locke never wrote that because nobody ever cites that. And the fact
because it's inconvenient.
Yeah, when you marry that with what he said, then his whole approach to government and everything else becomes so much more informed and it makes so much more sense, and it's so much more credible. In other words, it's a disservice to Locke what these people are doing.
Well, it's a disservice to him, but it's also in service of themselves. And, you know, I apologize again for just jumping in and
it's fine. I don't, Bob, I love it. I love it. And you know, I when I read this quote, that's the first thing I thought. I said, my God, this is so rich.
Well, the bottom line is that if you include those chocolate chips in the cookie recipe, to extend my metaphor, then you can't have Walton heirs. And you can't have the Mellons. And you can't have Carnegie. And you can't have Rockefellers. Can you?
No. And see, the only way that they can justify their existence is to cherry pick the justifications for their right to power and influence. In other words, they've got to eliminate some of the things that are very difficult to explain. They've got to make sure that they go, if they're dealing with Locke and the whole idea of private property and the role of government to protect private property, and they cite all the time, they cite Madison's Federalist number 10 on this. The implication, you know, of what they say is that the only people who have rights at all are the propertied.
Well, is there an argument to be made that you cannot, proceeding from that assertion by Locke, that you cannot, a century later, then have someone saying from each according to his means to each according to his needs?
Oh, that's an interesting, yeah, that exactly. And that, of course, that's the most hated philosophy of of the modern era here in the West, in the United States, is that idea.
Oh, I know. There was ominous music behind me when I said it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And you know, God will get you for that, Bob. And
I think he already did.
But now, seriously, you're right, and that's why it seems to me that we've got to basically demand access to more and more information. We've got to basically be sure that we know what the basis of the positions we adopt are, rather than falling for a cherry-picked argument that seems to look good on the surface but can't stand the scrutiny of analysis and questions.
Do we not also need, Dr. Bill, to make certain that our understanding of the commons is as broad as it must be? And by that I mean, you know, you say the commons, and a school kid will, well, maybe, I don't know anymore, will think of sheep grazing on a piece of grass in the middle of Boston.
Right.
But do we not also need to understand the commons as a river that flows through several states?
That's right. That's
or
right.
Or the air above us?
The air. Not only that, but
or even the tax structure that supports civil government.
The airwaves, the internet. In other words, we have, you know, in our society, we have this tendency to make everything a commodity and establish a price or a value to it. And once you do that, then it becomes susceptible to private ownership.
Well, isn't that the history of West Virginia for the last 150 years?
It is. It is. And so the idea of commons needs to be emphasized. Now, what made it, and this is my own perception, but it seems to me what makes any kind of conversation about the commons difficult is the idea that we're talking about generations of people who've been raised believing that the most horrible thing that you can be called or that can happen is something called communism. And the idea, in anything that's associated with that. And, you know, I mean, in other words, the most powerful weapon that enemies of the president can use against President Obama are to call him a socialist. And the reason for that is because the general understanding in our society of communism and socialism is so skewed and so, you know, political that you're appealing to stereotype definitions. If you call somebody a communist, that's all you need to know. You don't know anything. You
at that point, the conversation's over, isn't it?
Exactly.
I mean, there are two things: child abuser, communist.
Communist.
And the charge alone is enough to
drive anybody away that might even consider supporting you or even listening to you.
Yes. And see, thanks to you and people like Dr. John, I have an evolving, what I hope is appreciation and understanding, or I'm trying to have one, for the nature of humanity itself. If we understand that humans, as we understand humans to be, have been, and it's a very short span of time really, wandering around on this planet for about 40,000 years, 35,000 of them were experienced without concepts of property. That's or right. of land ownership property. Mm-hmm. 35,000 of those years were experienced with the only working definition being the commons itself.
Right.
And we sit here, and I sit here, and I indict myself first in this, not anybody else. But we sit here with some sort of smug pretension that we are somehow living better than human beings did for 35,000 years.
This is considered, this is defined as progress. I mean, this is...
Well, it's progress, it's civilization. I mean, we presume that we are more intelligent than those humans were 35,000 years ago. We presume that we live better, we act more ethically, that we act with greater informed more informed presence in our world. I think we assume that we love better, that we raise our children better, that we eat better, that we breathe better. And on almost every one of those topics, Dr. Bill,
every day in every way we're getting better. Every way we're getting better and better.
And yet on every one of those topics, that assertion is almost entirely, completely, totally wrong.
It's based on a set of cultural and political priorities that we've successful sold, and you know the word, and that's the idea of the commons. I mean, one of the things that amazed me was that in the development of cities in America, I'm thinking of Central Park and the Boston Commons and Grant Park and Chicago, and major cities realized that there had to be these common places which belonged to everybody, which no one or no group of people owned, but everybody owned. And they realized that this was an important part of governing a municipality, governing a city, with different levels and kinds of people involved in different professions and different ways of life and all of that. And ultimately, what you had to do was find out what it was that all of them needed and make sure that it was there should anyone need it. And we've lost that. And we've allowed political considerations like our fear of communism and socialism and Marx and all the rest of it. You know, I can remember, Bob, and this is kind of personal, but I can remember I was working on the preface, the prologue to a book, and I asked a friend of mine to read it, and he read it, and he is a good friend. And he said, the only thing I have to say about that is that your whole analysis is Marxist. And I said, excuse me? And then I started to ask more questions of him. And the fact of the matter is he really couldn't respond to any more questions, because once he had concluded that, then nothing I said mattered.
Right, because the whole analysis became...
And I've had to really dodge that issue in order to maintain that friendship, because I don't go back to that. I thanked him and for giving me for doing me the honor of reading it and responding to it. But once you respond to something and call it that, then that closes the book on it.
In this country.
I'm done, yeah.
In this country. Because we must remember that many parts of the rest of the world are still having meaningful conversations about the relative merits of Marxism versus capitalism versus anarcho-syndicalism or what have you.
And I mean, look at what the Scandinavians are doing with healthcare and education, and now the rest of the world is moving so rapidly ahead of us. This whole debate over the Common Core. One of the things I've got here in my to-do list for our future programs is to revisit the issue of the Common Core. And one of the things I want to focus on is an article that George Will wrote on the Common Core about a week ago, and it's unbelievable because it's very clear that the agenda never changes. It's always the same agenda. The issues change, but the agenda never does. But the whole idea of the Common Core is, and the need for it, is based on the fact that we're falling behind everybody in terms of the way we educate our young. And part of the reason is, Bob, is because we've insisted throughout that the only safe thing we can do for our own security is to educate our younger generations according to the priorities and the prejudices that we've been talking about. And to basically suggest to them that to confuse them with a lot of information and a lot of data and a lot of stuff they don't need will save you all that. This is what you need to know. And it's obviously very skewed and very politically chosen, and that's really what state curriculum guides and all of that do. And so it seems to me the Common Core is a recognition of that we're going to have to find a way to compare ourselves and make ourselves competitive with what other people are doing, because they're leaving us in the dust in terms of the way we're educating our young people. And we need to basically appreciate why. And then we need to make the appropriate changes. It doesn't mean that, that our education system is totally gone or a total zero by any means, because one of the things we do more than any other culture is we claim that we try to educate the whole person, and we want our educated people to be, to be sensitive to beauty and to art and to music and to literature and to architecture and to the environment and all of these other things. I mean, that's basically what we claim. But the fact of the matter is we've kind of let a lot of that slip through the cracks, and we've got to find a way to restore it in order to once again make ourselves kind of the preeminent in the area of education. I don't think it's necessary.
Well, conversely, the failure to restore that, Dr. Bill, means that we're toast.
We become automatons. We become the willing doers of people who are more than willing to tell us exactly what to do and what not to do, and do not have anyone but themselves' best interest in heart. That's right, and that's really in large part what a lot of this digital information revolution stuff is all about, and this stuff about digital networking and all of that. That's where a lot of it's going, and the irony is that you kind of have to, on one hand, you have to kind of applaud the realization that is happening with the demise of human privacy, that whatever chance we have to protect a little bit of this and restore more is contingent on the extent to which we're able to maintain a little bit of our individuality, and that we don't lose it all. And that's really what's up for grabs here in this whole debate about about the digital revolution and about the second machine age and all the rest of it that Tom Friedman talked about last week. And that's kind of where I want to go back, because it's been a week since we've addressed that. But
I appreciate the chance to just chime in on this. I love our conversations.
I really appreciate it. I'm glad, because I really thought that this quote, he does such a good job of explaining exactly why the people who passed this legislation wanted to do it, how they justified it. I think that's a very
he got his degree from Stanford.
Oh, I didn't know that. I don't know him very well.
I know about it. I know more about him than I care to.
Okay.
I mean, this is at the same time a guy who said that we needed to drive grizzly bears extinct for Jesus.
Oh, okay.
I'm not kidding.
I don't think you learned that at Stanford.
Well, that's the thing. There are downstream effects of this, because you read something like that and you think, we need to dismantle Stanford brick by brick and salt the earth.
I know.
Dr.
Anyway,
Bill, thank you.
Bob, thank you. I appreciate it, buddy. Thank you. Wonderful conversation, Bob. I mean that. Don't ever feel hesitant at that. The fact that we're into a conversation about a piece of history like this is, again, this is a contemporary quotation, but on the other hand, it so well captures the mentality. And what I would say, and again, we're moving towards the top of our first hour here, and I don't want to start anything new right now when we're going to be taking a break. But one of the things that I did start to say to Bob at the end, and I wanted to say it now, is that the idea that Fisher is articulating in this about what was in the minds and of the people who passed this kind of legislation about property being required in order to be eligible to vote. This is a very, very difficult concept to get across to students, because you have to confront many of the political and social prejudices that they bring to the table. And I mean, they came through an educational system before they get to college. And I tell them that in my classes right away, that a lot of you think I've got all these advantages because I know all this history and stuff. The fact of the matter is, the one advantage I have over you as students in this class is I know what you believe before you walk in here about a variety of different things that we're going to be focusing on and talking about throughout the length and breadth of this course. I know what you think about freedom. I know what you think about property. I know what you think about America. I know what you think about separation of church and state. I know, in other words, I know what the priorities are of curriculum that has brought you to this point. So consequently, when you start talking about the fact that the people with the most property are the only ones that have the right to vote, and that's what the people in the colonial period in the early 18th century, in the middle 18th century believed. Actually, it's not just the early period, because right after the Revolution under the Confederation, many of the states who wrote constitutions in 1776 included property qualifications for voting and office holding. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, of the 13, 7 of them did. And of course, what happens is that over time, these qualifications become less and less and less as the idea begins to settle in that in order to maintain any kind of cohesion in society, you cannot afford to exclude large numbers of your citizens. And where this creates a real problem is in the South with the issue of slavery, because the institution of slavery, while it's economically it's a labor system, it speaks to the inhumanity of one group of people toward another and all the rest of it. The fact of the matter is, an institution like slavery was almost necessary in the South, because the mainstream of society did not accept the legitimacy of Africans as people, as human beings. And in a course that I was teaching this morning, for example, we were talking about the black codes passed after the Civil War. I put up on the overhead a copy of the Mississippi Black Codes of 1865. And this was the South's alternative to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. They knew, especially, and of course it becomes more and more clear with the 13th, 14th, and the so-called Civil War amendments, but Southern states knew that they could no longer retain slaves. So what they came up with in the slave codes is a system of social control which was so rigid and so trite and so unforgiving that effectively amounted to slavery. And so consequently, while they paid lip service to the idea that the freedmen, the ex-slaves, were free and had a right to work and all, and to employment and all the rest of it, and had a right to be paid, they also arranged these slave codes in such a way that all of the risk of crop failure and everything else was borne by the sharecropper. And so the system of agricultural labor that the South adopts as an alternative to slavery is so much like slavery, students had to see it in order to believe it. And that's kind of what I want, because this kind of stuff is very, very difficult for students to grasp, because we are not educated. Our schools don't teach us that things like attitudes like this even exist. The fact that there would be a general pervasive sense among white population in colonial America that the people who own the most are your brightest, most intelligent people, and therefore that entitles them to the most important power positions within society. Because if they weren't the most intelligent and the most capable of holding that particular office, they wouldn't hold or own as much property as they do. So the implication is that the amount of property one owns has a direct connection to one's ability and one's talent and one's business acumen and all the rest of it. And once that is established, once that settles in, then the other side of the coin settles in as well. Once you accept that as a reality, then it stands to reason that those without property are without property because they don't have the intelligence and the wisdom and the willingness to work and all the rest of it. The assumption is there's all sorts of opportunity out there, and those who are worthy have taken advantage of it. Those who are not worthy have not. And this sows the whole way of looking at the poor in this society from that point on until today. And all you need to do is hear the conversations about entitlements and about extending unemployment insurance and all the rest of it. And you begin to realize that people are coming from the same place today that they were coming from in the 18th century that Brian Fisher is talking about. It's absolutely incredible. That's why it's so important for students who are going to be citizens, who are going to be voting citizens and making decisions in this society, have to know this, have to know where we've been, in order that they can intelligently make determinations as to where we ought to go. And we won't tell them because it doesn't fit into our political or our economic agenda at this particular point in time. And I would suggest to you that's the reason why our education system continues to fall further and further behind the rest of the world. We're 1 minute after the hour. Let's pause and take a break at the top of the hour. And in 5 minutes, we'll come back and we'll pick up on the rest of today's program. I'm Bill O'Brien. This is the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. After a brief break, we'll be back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to those of you who are just joining today's program. I am Bill O'Brien. This is the Center for the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. And I thank you for joining us on this beautiful, so far, although we're looking at some weather this evening, but right now the weather here in Appalachia is just gorgeous. It's in the 40s, and it's bright and sunny, and the sky is blue, and it's deceiving from what the forecasts are telling us. It is a pleasure to be with you. I welcome you to the program if you're just joining us, and if you've been with us through the first hour and you listened to that conversation between Bob and me, on the quotation from Reverend Fisher, then on the link between property ownership and the right to vote, then you probably have a lot of ideas and opinions and considerations that you would like to share, and we would love to hear them from you. Please feel free to give us a call at area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. And if you'd rather communicate directly with me via email, then by all means I invite you to do that. My email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. As I mentioned during the conversation with Bob in the last hour, I did want to at least get back to the issue that we were addressing, but again, it's been a week, and so I really wanted to kind of to go back to the well, so to speak, and kind of lay the groundwork for some of the things that we were talking about last time we were together, because it deals specifically with the issue of what, for lack of a better term, we can call the digital revolution that is going on in the world right now. And, of course, going on in this nation as well as the rest of the world, as we know. But also it relates directly to the issues of privacy. And, of course, we've seen so much about privacy recently with the NSA information gathering business and Edward Snowden's release of so much documentation and all the rest of it. And the president himself, last Friday, just 3 days ago, made a speech, delivered a speech in which he focused specifically on curbs and alterations in NSA behavior and policy that he was going to implement in the interest, try to implement in the interests of citizen privacy. So all of this, it seems to me, is very, very relevant and very, very significant. We began to address this issue last time we were together by looking at an article that Tom Friedman wrote, and of course the date on that article, which is entitled "If I Had a Hammer," the date it appeared in the New York Times was the 11th of January, which is 10 days ago. And we talked about it, I believe, in last Monday's program. In this particular article, and I really kind of want to review this very quickly because I want to lay the groundwork so we can continue with this discussion. Friedman is referring to a book that he read. He claims it's one of the most fascinating books that he's read in a long time, the title of which is The Second Machine Age. And he opens his article with a story from that book about the Dutch chess grandmaster, Jan-Hein Donner, when asked how he'd prepare for a chess match against a computer, replied that, quote, "I would bring a hammer," unquote. And basically what Friedman's point is that what this story reveals is the attitude many people have towards the fact that technology is moving ahead so fast that none of us feel comfortable even close to keeping up with it. And that's really the point of this article. What these folks in the book called The Second Machine Age, Eric Bjornolfsson and Andrew McAfee, are suggesting that in effect, the so-called digital revolution, the technological revolution that we are experiencing today, is one that is rapidly leaving the vast majority of people behind. Not only because we can't keep up, but because we're not able to keep up. But if you pursue this even further, the point is the technology has gone so far that many of us don't have even the ability to keep up, even if we wanted to. Friedman points out these people, but I mean, most of the stuff is coming from this book that Friedman's writing about. The first machine age, these people argue, was the Industrial Revolution. And as we know, the Industrial Revolution was all about power systems and the increases in those power systems, innovations, the role of patents and inventions and all the rest of it. The key factor, however, the key point they want to make is that all of these, no matter how much power was improved, all of these required human beings to make decisions about them. So consequently, even though these inventions were being made and being applied to industrialism, they did not threaten humanity itself. In fact, they made human control and human labor more valuable and more important rather than less. Labor and machines, these authors argue, in the first machine age, labor and machines were complementary rather than antithetical to each other. The second machine age, however, and this is a quote from the book The Second Machine Age, "We are beginning to automate a lot more cognitive tasks, a lot more of the control systems that determine what to use that power for. In many cases today, artificially intelligent machines can make better decisions than humans," unquote. Consequently, what makes the distinction between the first machine age and the second machine age is that in the second, machines have become substitutes for rather than complements to human beings. And of course the result is that as these moves forward, as these digital changes are taking place, they are displacing more and more human beings. And as this quote points out, many of these machines are now able to move into cognitive areas which they were never able to do before during the first machine age. In the first machine age, all the cognitive ability that came to that required to bring to the table was human ability. But now we're seeing technological ability replacing some of that human ability. So consequently, the displacement of human beings, the elimination of jobs, is not just occurring amongst the lowest skills, but rather it is affecting many of those whose skills are pretty advanced and pretty polished. And then they go into characteristics of the second machine age that they feel are responsible for this, and they describe them as what they call 3 tipping points: exponential, digital, and combinatorial. The exponential is how one builds upon the other, and it's almost like compound interest in economics, that the result is the changes happen so fast that it becomes impossible for the vast majority of people to keep up with them. And to use this, the illustration that they use is the story of the king who invented chess. And the king was so excited that he offered the inventor any reward. The inventor suggested rice to feed his family. He asked the king to give him a grain of rice on the first square of a chessboard, and then for each subsequent square, twice as many grains of salt. In other words, double it each square. The emperor agreed until he realized that 63 instances of doubling yields a fantastically big number. And so I think when we first mentioned this article, I probably made the point that in this particular case, the inventor outmaneuvered the king. And of course, one of the comments to this article suggests that in today's world, the problem, the thing that Friedman doesn't realize, is in this world, it's the king that is manipulating the inventors, the people. That's a major change. Then Friedman goes into the spread of the internet and talks about, the fact that so many people on the planet have smartphones. And what it's doing is generating an incredible amount of data, more data than the human mind can comprehend. The result being that this data gives us the opportunity to discover and analyze patterns, directions, trends, because computers are able to accommodate so much more data than we can. And I can remember saying this, and I think it's very important. One of the major challenges that we have in our classrooms today is we have trouble getting youngsters to stand back and try to see any connection between separate pieces of data at all. The ability to analyze, let alone the ability to synthesize, and I'm emphasizing those 2 words. I don't want to get diverted here, but I don't want to let the opportunity pass without focusing on those 2 words. If you look at the Common Core standards that there's so much debate about today, what you will see in the Common Core are the use of terms like analyze and synthesize, and asking students to rank and to establish a rank order of the most important to the least important, and to explain why. In other words, to argue for their point of view, why this is more important than that. And the ability of students not only to analyze data, but to synthesize independent pieces of data is one of the greatest challenges to our entire educational system. I guess I have to ask her, believe me here, because I don't have any evidence, I can't give you any numbers. But one of the things I've realized over a half century of teaching at the college level is that there's very little of this even going on at the college level. There's some, Most of the time, you find it at the graduate level. But even there, it's not nearly as plentiful and as evident as it ought to be. The fact of the matter is, our teacher preparation programs tend to be woefully deficient on preparing teachers to teach students how to analyze and how to synthesize data, how to connect things, how to find links between things that don't have an obvious connection. And so if you present 5 independent and somewhat different pieces of data to a student and ask them to write an essay which is based on the information and the evidence gleaned from those 5 pieces of data, many of our students are unable to do it. And yet the reality of the world that we're talking about is that the reason that computers are being able to take over more and more of the cognitive functions that used to be exclusively belonging to the human being, to the human brain, is because technology has the ability to incorporate and synthesize so much more data than the human mind is capable of dealing with. We can't deal with all of this stuff, but the machines can. And so consequently, because they can, and because they can perceive or articulate or identify trends or patterns or directions that things seem to be moving in, consequently, they are directly related to problem solving and decision making. People want to know those trends, and they want to know the data. They want to know the directions and the data and the information that synthesizing that much data can generate. But unfortunately, the human mind can't do it because there's so much of it. But in our education system, so few of our young people can do it at all, that you begin to see where I think where a major part of the problem comes. The result is that when you look at the amount of data and the ability of these modern machines, digital technological innovations, to make change, suddenly you begin to appreciate the speed and the degree of change, how fast it's moving. It's very, very much like compound interest. It's very much like 1 grain of rice becoming 2 grains of rice, becoming 4 grains of rice, becoming 8 grains of rice, becoming 16 grains of rice, becoming 32 grains of rice, becoming 64 grains of rice. I'm not going any further. The next one's 128, but I'm not going beyond that. But I think you see the point. The exponential factor is critical here because it makes keeping up even less likely and less possible. And then finally, these folks point out, these authors point out, the idea of combining different pieces of technology. And the example that Friedman gives is Google Maps and smartphone apps like Waze. And this is about driving. And so if you marry these two, if you pull them together and combine them, the results are incredible. And so that's what's happening today, is that when you combine these kinds of things, when you think of the data out there and you begin to combine them, you begin to realize so much more information is available than we ever even dreamed was available. This is the final paragraph of Friedman's article, and this was really the focus of our conversation. Put all of these advances together, say these authors, and you can see that our generation will have more power to improve or destroy the world than any before, relying on fewer people and more technology. But it also means that we really need to rethink, deeply rethink, our social contracts, because labor is so important to a person's identity and dignity and to the stability of society. These authors suggest that we consider lowering taxes on human labor to make it cheaper relative to digital labor, that we reinvent education so more people can race with the machines, not against them, that we do much more to foster the entrepreneurship that invents new industries and new jobs, and even consider guaranteeing every American a basic income. We've got a lot of rethinking to do, they argue, because we're not only in a recession-induced employment slump, we're in a technological hurricane that is reshaping the workplace, and it just keeps doubling. One of the things that I think is very, very significant here is the issue raised by these folks of reinventing education so that more people can keep up. As you begin to read much of the other literature, you begin to appreciate the fact that for most people this is not possible. As technology becomes more and more sophisticated, fewer and fewer people can handle it. The result is that more and more people find themselves unable to grasp the nuances of the technology that is more and more controlling their lives. And that creates the crisis. Because if we believe that labor, work, is so important to our self-worth, our self-esteem, our dignity, what we are as a person is frequently defined by what we do. And those people that can't find work in a society like ours, which puts so much attention and credibility on work, if you ask people, what do you do? Many people respond, I don't do anything. I'm between jobs right now. I can't find a job, i.e., I don't do anything. Or even worse, women who will say, I don't do anything. I'm a parent or a housekeeper. I raise my children. What that does, it seems to me, is speak to the degree to which work defines us as a civilization. Yet here we are on the fast track to technological innovation, which is minimizing work to the point that we're entering a situation where fewer and fewer of us are ever going to be able to find meaningful jobs, because fewer and fewer of us can keep up, can race with the machines. So while improving the education system, reinventing it, they say, is significant, we've got to begin to introduce students to skills that they don't know they didn't have. Because most of our education system has been information-based. It's been driven by information, by facts, content. Most of our tests are content-driven. Do you know this? Do you know that? Do you know which of the following list of people did such and such? Which of the following dates is the most appropriate? In a sense, our whole education system has been focused on student mastery of individual pieces of information. We have never crossed the line in our education system where we have asked people to students to amass separate, independent pieces of information and find ways that they connect, find ways that they interrelate, synthesize data. And yet that's what cognitive skills are all about. And those people whose education prepares them to do this are the ones who are experiencing success. the rest of us tend to be falling by the wayside. But the danger here is that as this technology continues to improve exponentially, fewer and fewer people are going to be able to keep up. And what we're talking about here, and this is another piece of another book that I wanted to introduce. If not today, then we'll get to it in tomorrow's program. A book that is out now called "Who Owns the World," and it focuses principally on digital networks, on networking, and what digital networks are doing to contribute to this problem that these folks identify in the second machine age. And so the fact of the matter is, what it seems to be we really need to deal with, I mean, one of the things they mention is the need to reinvent education. I think we've made a comment or two about that. But the issue of rethinking our social contracts, rethinking what makes our society a society, rethinking what's going to hold our society together and keep all of us moving in the same direction. What's necessary to make it possible for all of us to live together. What's possible to sustain our way of life in the face of changes which are driving more and more of us outside the system, so to speak, making more and more of us unable to contribute meaningfully to the public interest. And probably the most significant indicator of this is the extent to which people are finding it harder and harder to find jobs. Jobs are being destroyed, jobs are being eliminated, and those who really buy into the idea of free enterprise capitalism will usually refer to this as creative destruction. That's what the economists talk about, is something called creative destruction. And the idea is that an economy which is growing and expanding is constantly destroying jobs but creating new ones. The problem with this form of destruction, job destruction, is it's not creative destruction in the sense that it is permitting people to move from one form of employment to another. More often than not, the kind of change we're dealing with now is rendering those displaced unemployable. And there are serious questions as to whether, in fact, we can even make the kinds of changes in our education system which would allow more of us to keep up. We could do better. But the degree to which change is happening here, this last line about it just keeps doubling, is the sense that the machines are running so far and so fast ahead of us that more and more of us are dropping out of the race and falling by the wayside. So consequently, rethinking social contracts involves things like dealing with the reality. What are we going to do with people who can't find meaningful work as we've traditionally defined it? Is guaranteeing people a minimum income enough? Are people going to be satisfied that they have a roof over their head and enough to eat and clothes to wear? Is that enough? When you start to get into the issues of self-esteem and human dignity and the psychology of what makes us all feel important and what all of us need, which is a sense that we're doing something worthwhile and that we matter, how do we deal with this, with those realities, in the face of this kind of technological change? It seems to me a critically important challenge. I don't pretend to have the answers. But I am comfortable in saying that we better start asking the questions. And we better start dealing with the realities of this kind of thing. And we better start questioning those people who are so sure that they know which way we ought to go and what we ought to do and what we need to do. This works and that doesn't and all the rest of it. Basically, what we need to realize is that we're confronting the kinds of changes and challenges that we've not really confronted before. About a week before Friedman wrote that article called If I Had a Hammer, an article appeared in the New York Times written by Joe Nocera, who's a regular columnist in the New York Times. Joe Nocera, N-O-C-E-R-A. And the reason I spell his name, because if you go on the New York Times website and you type in archives, this is January 6th, 2014, 2 weeks ago. The title of the article, Will Digital Networks Ruin Us? And it ties directly into this. I think it's an extension of it. Joe Nocera says that the most important book he read last year was a book by Jaron Lanier, first name J-A-R-O-N, last name Lanier, L-A-N-I-E-R, entitled Who Owns the Future? Nocera points out that the book was published in May, but he didn't get to read it till the end of the year. But as he says, as a columnist, it turned out to be a good thing, in a way, because with unemployment seemingly stalled out at 7%, he says, in the aftermath of the Great Recession, and with the leak of thousands of National Security Agency documents making the news daily, the Edward Snowden situation, and continuing stories about the erosion of privacy in the digital economy. And I'm thinking, as I'm sure all of you are, about the breaches that occurred over Christmas time in Target sales at Target stores and Neiman Marcus stores, and now they're suggesting it probably is in a lot of other areas. The title of this book, Who Owns the Future? Nocera says, put forth a kind of universal theory that ties all of these different things together. This is, for him it did. And he finds it very interesting. And he points out that the author, Lanier, is well placed to write such an article about the digital economy. He was there at its creation. He founded the first company to sell virtual reality products. One of his startups was sold to Google. As a consultant, he has had assignments with Walmart, Fannie Mae, major banks, and hedge funds. So when he talks about the challenge of who owns the future, he seems to have the credentials to basically address the topic. The difference is that unlike many of those who he has worked with in the past, he has come to feel, Lanier, now not Nocera, who's writing this article, the author of the book, Who Owns the Future, Jaron Lanier, has come to feel that the digital networks are in fact no panacea at all. They are a threat. From his book. What I came away with from having access to these varied worlds was a realization that they were all remarkably similar. The big players often gain benefits from digital networks to an amazing degree, but they were also constrained, even imprisoned, by the same dynamics. What he points out is that network efficiencies at the outset give particular organizations tremendous advantages over the competition, but that eventually these networks backfire. One example he uses is Walmart. To manage its supply chain and the benefits that Walmart was able to get out of that. Walmart's chain of supply and stocking its stores was absolutely beyond belief. Nobody could match it. But Lanier points out, over time, it cost competitors and suppliers hundreds of thousands of jobs. And this is a quote, gradually impoverishing its own customer base, unquote. So in a sense, what he's pointing out is that Walmart is beginning to reap what it sowed. He has other examples. I have the book on Kindle, and I was going to go to Kindle and read you directly from the book, but I won't bother right now because we're moving towards the end of our program. But one of the other problems, if you will, is that eventually these networks take control. Examples he uses: Facebook, Google, Twitter, Amazon. He points out that it's only a matter of time before their advantages begin to disintegrate. They are big and successful now because of what they've been able to do. But the irony is what they've been able to do down the road will sink them. So besides this, there are two additional keys to what Lanier is arguing in Who Owns the Future. The first major point he wants to make is that the digital economy has done as much as any single one thing to hollow out the middle class. He believes that these digital networks and their absolute thirst for information, they've got to have information, data. They function on data. They prevail over the competition because they're able to collect and apply more data than their competitors. And, of course, the reality is, where does the data come from? It comes from us. We are the ones that are generating the data that allows these networks to prosper. And he points out that more than any one thing, this digital economy is what is weakening and destroying the middle class in America, in the world. And he points out, for example, that globalization is another form of network efficiency. The two examples that he uses, which I think they struck me powerfully: Kodak and Instagram. Most of us know about Kodak. At its height, Lanier writes, and this is what I was going to read you from the book, Kodak employed, at its height, more than 140,000 people. Now it's bankrupt. In 2012, Instagram, which is the digital program that is responsible for cameras being in smartphones and cell phones, and more than anything else drove Kodak out of business. In 2012, Instagram was sold to Facebook for $1 billion. Instagram employed 30 people. Those numbers are astounding. First of all, you've got to accept the fact that if Kodak employed 140 people, then it would seem logical to conclude that the vast majority of those 140,000 people were skilled. It was 140,000 people on an assembly line with a third-grade education, not the kind of workers that allowed Kodak to become what Kodak became in the marketplace. So one has to conclude that the vast majority of the 140,000 people displaced by Kodak were skilled people. One would logically expect then that these 140,000 people would move into another job. That's the way creative destruction in the economy has always worked. Well, the firm, the organization that is most directly connected to Kodak is Instagram. While it was sold for $1 billion to Facebook, it only employed 13 people. Without getting into higher math, that suggests 139,987 people that worked at Kodak but are not at Instagram. And obviously allowing for the fact that many of them moved into totally different areas or whatever, the fact of the matter is the vast majority of Kodak's workforce was rendered unemployable by the digital revolution reflected in the success of Instagram. And it became a $1 billion organization. Lanier points out, Instagram isn't worth $1 billion because of the 13 employees it has are super extraordinary. In other words, you don't say, take 13 and divide it into $1 billion, and that's how much each of those 13 people are worth. We know that's not true. And this is the final point. This is a quote. Instead, he says, Instagram's value comes from the millions of users who contribute to the network without being paid for it. Networks need a great number of people to participate in them to generate significant value. But when they have them, only a small number of people get paid. This has the net effect of centralizing wealth and limiting overall economic growth. Clearly, in Lanier's point of view, economic equality in America is directly connected to the digital economy. Because by definition, the digital economy is taking information, data, that is being generated by all of us. And it's all going to the same place. And only a very, very few people are deriving benefit from it. The Jeff Bezoses, the Warren Buffetts, the Bill Gateses. You can begin to see what has enabled these people to be so successful. It's their control of information and data. And in order to maintain their success, they need more data and more data and more data. And that means they need us. But we're being rendered unemployable by their success. This is Nocera's conclusion. It is Lanier's radical idea that people should get paid whenever their information is used. He envisions a different kind of digital economy in which creators of content, whether a blog post or a Facebook photograph, would receive micropayments whenever their content is used. A digital economy that seems to give away things for free in return for being able to invade the privacy of its customers for commercial gain is not free at all, he argues. Basically, what he suggests is that in the process of generating all of this information, which these digital networks need, we are effectively surrendering our privacy. And we're doing it in such a piecemeal manner that most of us don't even realize it. And if you go back to the previous article, the one written by Tom Friedman that we looked at, and you talk about the concept of combining different forms of digital technology, combining programs, we're generating data into one particular situation for reasons which we are explained, and it goes back to something basic, like when you check out of Lowe's, for example, or Home Depot, they want your zip code or your home phone. And you're giving it in that one little situation. But what does the network do with it? It ends up being churned up in this big database, and the sum total is it ends up being connected with something else you did somewhere else. For example, you used at the grocery store, when you bought your groceries for the week, you used one of those swipe cards, which gives you the special deals in that store. You get special pricing on a lot of goods provided you have a card. And so we would be foolish to not use the card. In fact, every time I check out of the grocery store, the cashier will usually say, when he gives me my receipt, you saved $7.35 by shopping here because of the special deals I got. But in the real world, what I've done is I have generated into the database, into this giant data bank in the sky, if you will, the fact that I drink beer, the fact that I drink light beer, the fact that I buy beer every week. And so consequently, what I've told them is I'm a beer drinker, but I drink light beer, which probably suggests that I carry more weight than I believe I should. Whereas people that buy the really high-powered, expensive beers, the whole beer, not the light beer, are not heavy beer drinkers. They'll drink one beer. But if you're a light beer drinker, one reason you are a light beer drinker is because you drink more than one. And so all of that information is out there, and you could put it all together. Then all you got to do is connect with the purchases I make at my pharmacy when I go have prescriptions filled. And they look at the particular medications that I'm on, and they look at the grocery order I buy, and suddenly you can almost tell everything about me. The brands I use, the quantity I use, and on and on and on. And the point is, we're generating all of this data out there into the stratosphere, so to speak, and we're leaving it to be, the data to be crunched by people we don't know, people we know nothing about, people whose motives we know nothing about. We don't know what they're going to do with the information we've given them. The only solution or solace we have is by concluding that there's so much data out there that chances are they'll never focus on mine. And the only thing I got going for me is that my data is mixed in with everybody else's data. But the point is that these digital networks have the capability of organizing data, which is what we talked about our education system not doing. These digital systems are able to process data in such a way that they are able to visualize trends and links and directions and things that apply particularly to us. And suddenly all of this data from all of these different directions comes together. And the result is we do not have any privacy anymore. And at the same time, we're struggling politically and constitutionally to try to even get the right of privacy recognized as legitimate in our political republic, in this American republic. There are many people that will argue that the right to privacy as being a human right does not exist because it wasn't in the Constitution. However, the Constitution, in the 9th of the first 10 amendments, Bill of Rights, the 9th one says that recognition of the rights listed herein does not deny the fact that at future times other rights might be included depending on changed circumstances, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I can't remember the exact wording of it, but basically it's the suggestion that there could be more rights added. And most of the supporters of privacy as a constitutional right will point to the 9th Amendment and say that it's under that right falls. And the debates are flying. The point is that there are so many private sector organizations and groups that have access to pieces of our privacy that one has to wonder about the overreaction to the data collection of the National Security Agency, the NSA. Most of us believe that our privacy is safer in the hands of private sector data collectors than it is in the hands of government. It might be. But I would suggest to you that while we focus, and while the president focuses on finding ways to rein in the NSA in its quest for information and data in order to combat terrorism, we can't afford to ignore any longer the masses of data that are flowing to the private sector, primarily so that it can be turned around and reorganized and sold to us as part of the commercial population. In other words, we are potential consumers, and all of this data allows that consumerism to become much more informed. And companies will buy, corporations will buy this data, buy this information one from the other, because it's so beneficial and valuable to their bottom line. Incredibly important stuff. Constitutional, part of a program related to the Constitution of the United States and civic responsibility, you bet it is. I think it's very important. We'll continue it tomorrow. We're at 58 minutes after the hour, and we're going to kind of wind up here at the Virtual Center. I want to thank you for being with us. I want to thank Bob Kincaid for his contributions in our first hour. Most of all, I want to invite you to think about some of this information. I hope it was beneficial. It got you thinking. I don't have any answers. I just have a lot of questions. But I'm hoping that it gets you thinking to the point that when we come back on the air tomorrow, that you'll pick up the phone and give us a call, 304-658-3333. It's an easy number to remember, and there are so many people out there that are waiting to hear from you. We have 1 minute left in our time together today. This is Bill O'Brien for the Virtual Center. We have some bad weather coming in from the north through the eastern half of the country. Please be safe, be careful, because we want you back with us again. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so much for listening. Be safe.